everyone, and welcome to Chapter 11. In this chapter, we're going to talk about pre-experimental and experimental research designs, but really this is the first in a series of chapters that talk about different types of designs. So basically, when you have a research question, you want to do some sort of study, you have to make a lot of decisions. You have to decide, is it going to be a quantitative or a qualitative or a mixed method study? We have to conceptualize and then operationalize. How are we going to study and how are we going to measure this? We have to decide, is this going to be an exploratory study or a descriptive or an explanatory study? And then we have to pick our specific research design, which we'll talk about in chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14. So this section of chapters kicks off with the discussion of inference, which Rubin and Babbie define as a conclusion that can be logically drawn in light of our research design and findings. If I come up with findings to my research study, I want to be able to confidently and logically say, yes, the findings that I found answer my research question, or they align with my hypothesis. And so you might think that's easy, but sometimes external events can affect that. Or we have causal inference, which is the inference that the findings imply that changes in the independent variable affect the dependent variable. So this idea that A caused B, or changes in A caused changes in B. So Rubin and Babbie talk about the 6 assumptions needed for causality. One is time sequence. We have to be able to say that the cause happened before the effect. They didn't happen at the same time. No, it's that a change in the independent variable then caused an effect in the dependent variable, or a change. So we have to say that the cause happened before the effect. We also have to talk about correlation. There has to be some sort of relationship between the two variables. We have to be able to feel confident that a change in the cause or the independent variable was accompanied by changes in the effect. So if we're changing the independent variable, but there's no change in the dependent variable, we can't necessarily say there's a causal relationship, and vice versa. If I don't change the independent variable at all, but my dependent variable numbers are all over the place, changing frequently, that's not really a strong relationship either. So we have to say that changes in one cause change in the other. Finally, we have to be able to rule out alternative explanations. We talked about moderating and mediating variables and extraneous variables. We really need to see, did something happen outside my study that could have affected the results? Or can I confidently say that it was only the change in my independent variable that caused the changes in the dependent variable? So Rubin and Babbie talk about the need for strength of correlation. They use the example of the relationship between cigarettes and health issues like cancer. We can't do a true research design and say, I'm going to randomly give cigarettes to this group of people and not cigarettes to the other group, smoke for a while, and we'll see which one of you ends up sick. We're not able to do that. That would be so unethical. But there is a lot of research and a lot of medical records and a lot of people who have experienced different types of health issues related to smoking. And so it's a very strong correlation that we can say that there's a lot of evidence that one caused the other, even though we don't necessarily have a traditional experiment for it. Also, plausibility and coherence. If you've done a bunch of literature reviews and 180 articles find one thing, and you do the same study or a similar one and you get totally different results, we have to say, was it the study design? Was it really accurate? Or your findings really finding a causal relationship or not? So we want to say, does it match existing theory and knowledge? Then finally, do we have consistency when replicated? If I do this study over and over and over, do I get the same effects between the cause and effect or the independent variable and dependent variable, or is it different every time? If it is, we may not be able to say that there's a causal relationship between the two. So we talked a little bit about validity and reliability in some of the previous chapters. And if you remember, validity relates to the idea of, are we accurately measuring what we think we are measuring? And when you're looking at validity related to causality, there's 2 types. One is internal validity. So this is that confidence that we have that the results of the study accurately depicts whether one variable is or is not a cause of the other. This is if I say, hey, changes in this caused effects in this, I have confidence to say that is accurately showing what happened in that relationship. We also have external validity, which is this idea that what is the extent to which we can generalize the findings of our study? If I'm studying a group of undergraduate students in a social work 101 class, do I feel confident that based on my study design, I can say, hey, I found these results, but I think this could apply to all students in social work 101 classes? That can be hard to do. And so depending on our design, we want to make sure that we've got strong internal validity and strong external validity. Now, one thing the book talks about are threats to internal validity. So this is when something other than the independent variable causes changes in the dependent variable. We think A causes B, but we find is maybe something else happened that caused that change. And now we're incorrectly attributing the change to our intervention or changes in our independent variable when that's not the case. So there's a number of threats threats to internal validity. There's a lot of great websites with an overview of this as well if you're struggling, because this can be kind of a challenging concept to think about all the different threats that there are. But some of the ones that we commonly talk about are things like history. So this could be that we see a change from a pre-test to a post-test in a group of people, and we say, whew, it must have been my intervention. But later we find out, no, there was something that happened at the university or in the clinic where the participants were, or the community, that changed participant views or scores, not the intervention itself. We also have something called maturation. It's just the idea that people grow and change. If I'm measuring a bunch of students that go into 6th grade and then measure a bunch of students going into 8th grade, students automatically grow and change over that period of time. And so I could say, oh, my intervention worked during middle school, or could it be that they just grew and developed and changed? Also, we have what are called testing effects, which is this idea that you can take or retake a test to influence results. So if someone scores really low on a self-esteem test, you may put them in your self-esteem group, but they may also say, wow, my self-esteem is really struggling. I'm going to do an outside group. I'm going to read books about self-esteem. I'm going to go see a therapist about it. Well, you might say, oh, look, their self-esteem increased. My intervention was effective. Or it increased because they saw their score and they made outside changes to increase their self-esteem. Maybe your intervention had nothing to do with it. You also see things like instrumentation changes. If you have a period of time between the pre-test and the post-test, the scale may have changed. Maybe it was updated. Maybe you used version 1 with your one study, but version 3 with a different study. And so that could affect it. You also could have issues between raters. Remember, we talked about inter-rater reliability. We also have statistical regression, which is the idea that a lot of times our clients that score at an extreme level may start moving closer to the middle of a test even without intervention. Then maybe you hit someone on a really, really bad day. They're really frustrated. They score really high on an anger scale, but just over time, they kind of calm down. They work through it on their own. Maybe it has nothing to do with your intervention. Maybe they just calm down. They see what happened. They've analyzed it and they're less upset and angry. Also, you have selection biases, which makes it difficult to have comparable groups. We cannot force anybody to do research for us. And so because of that, we ask for volunteers. And when you have volunteers, they may automatically be more motivated. And so it can make it really hard to have a comparison or a control group. And finally, there's directional ambiguity. Sometimes the order is unclear. We think A causes B, but actually B causes A. And so that can be another threat to internal validity. So to control for or reduce effects of threats, we use different types of research designs to address this. We have pre-experimental and experimental designs, which we'll talk about in this chapter, quasi-experimental designs, which are very popular in social work research in chapter 12. We'll discuss single case evaluation designs in chapter 13 and program evaluation designs in chapter 14. So let's talk about pre-experimental research designs. The first one the book talks about is a one-shot case study. And you'll see that research designs are typically noted by a series of X's and O's. In this case, you have X as the stimulus or intervention and O is the observation. This is how we measure the dependent variable. So let's say I'm offering a one-night parenting class for parents at my kid's school. And they come in and the X is the intervention. It's this one-night parenting class. And I say, you know what? At the end, I want to do a survey. I want to see what the parents' perceptions were of the training or the class itself. And I want to see what their perceptions of positive parenting interventions are. Now, I can do this. The challenge is if we've only got a post-test, this one observation, how do we know things have changed? Now, maybe if we had done a pre-test, we could see a change. Oh, look, they have way more understanding of positive parenting interventions. But because we only have the intervention in this post-test, we don't really have a way to compare and see what the changes are. It could be that the changes that they had something to do with history. Maybe something happened during the class that changed their perspective of things. So this is a one-shot case study, and it's a limitation because we don't have a baseline and we don't really know how something has changed. And we can't assess our changes over a time period. So how do we know that history or maturation hasn't affected that end result? So one way we could do it is the one group pre-test post-test design. Maybe my parents come in and I give them a pre-test to measure their knowledge of positive parenting practices. They go through my one-night training and then they do a post-test. Well, this can help. We can now see changes across time, but it's still vulnerable to history or maturation. Maybe something happened externally that affected the entire group. And because we don't have any sort of comparison or control group, we wouldn't necessarily be able to tell. So with this one, it's more effective than a one-shot case study, but there's still quite a few of limitations and it has low internal validity. And we note this as O1. So the O is the pretest, observation 1. Then we have X, the intervention, and O as post-test 2. If you see O on its own, that's one observation, but if it's O1 or O2 or O3, that's related to the first observation second, third, and so on. Finally, we have what's called a post-test only design with non-equivalent groups. So again, this is where you have a stimulus or intervention and then the observation. And so you might have two groups. You have the one group, the parents that went to the parenting class, you do a post-test, and then maybe you just do a post-test with some of the other parents in the school. So this is helpful because you can see differences between groups, but how do we really know the groups are similar? Let's say I'm doing a study and I look at students in a psychology 101 class. I measure students on Monday class at 8:30 and students at 4:30 on Tuesday. And I might say, look, they're similar groups. They're all Psych 101 students. But maybe the students that are in the early morning class are more motivated. Maybe the students that take the later class know they're going to be up partying the night before and they're going to be exhausted, so they take a later class. Maybe one group is more motivated than the other. And so because we don't have a pre-test to see if the groups were similar, we only have this post-test. Again, it's very challenging for us to say, hey, were there any changes that occurred? Was there any difference between those who had the intervention and those who didn't? So even though these types of designs may have lower internal validity and they're vulnerable to threat, they do provide information for us. Sometimes they help us identify any obstacles. Maybe you give this pre-test and post-test and realize that it's way too long, or they're super exhausted at the end of it, or it doesn't seem to align between the pre-test and post-test. So doing these kinds of pre-experimental designs are good. They allow us to see any obstacles, to see if our hypothesis is even plausible, and then we can say, okay, we've ironed out the kinks. These are pilot studies. Now we can do it with a larger group of people. When we're looking at experimental research designs, let's say we really need two groups. We say, you know what, it's not enough to analyze one. We really want to do two groups. But like the example I used with the post-test, we have one group that's more motivated. Those are the volunteer, they're all in one class, and so we put them in one group. We could say, oh, those students are that intervention was so effective because look how motivated those students are compared to the other group. But maybe it has nothing to do with your intervention. So one way to address this is to use an experimental research design. And these are designs that attempt to provide maximum control for threats to internal validity. So what you use is random assignment. Let's say instead of saying, hey, one group's already all put together and the other one is a separate group, we're going to use random assignment. We're going to pool all the students from the 8:30 a.m. on Monday and the 4:30 p.m. on Tuesday. We're going to pool them all together, and then we're going to randomly assign them to one of two groups. And those in the experimental group with the X and the O are going to experience intervention, and then we'll do a measurement. People in the other group, no intervention, and then we're going to do a measurement at the end. By using random assignment, we kind of assume that maybe you'll have a nice mixture. Some of your more motivated students will be in both groups, and some of your less motivated students will be in both groups. And so the idea is then that mix of students experiences the intervention. You would hope that if the intervention's effective, we'd see changes in that group because of that mixture of motivated and unmotivated. So random assignment is great because it really means that we have a stronger sense of, are the changes we're seeing less about the selection bias, the people who chose this group, and more about the intervention itself. So there are several different types of research designs, experimental research designs. One is called the classic experimental design or the pre-test post-test control group design. So in this one, you randomly assign participants to two groups. Both of them do a pre-test, and then one of them gets the intervention and both of them take the post-test. So this is great because it controls for things like history. You would assume that if you randomly assign your pool of participants into these two groups, if something was happening externally to these participants that could affect them, you would imagine that both groups would see a change. Or maturation, you would assume that if you've randomly mixed up a group of students, let's say elementary age students, that if maturation was the cause of the change, you'd see that in both groups, right? Because there's a mix of students of all types of motivations. So this is a good way to control for some of those threats to internal validity. By having two groups that are randomly assigned, you can see progression and say, hey, am I more confident that the intervention is affecting that post-test in one group, or is it something externally that's happening and affecting all participants? Now, this is a little bit challenging when testing or retesting can become an issue. So if I think, ooh, the administration of that pretest affected students' awareness or participation, which then affected their post-test result, I can do a different type of study. And this is called a post-test only control group design. This is where, again, you randomly assign individuals to either the experimental group with the intervention or the control group. They don't have a pretest, but because they're randomly assigned, we can assume that maybe some of the difference in the post-test has to do with whether or not they got the intervention. Another example is the Solomon 4-group design, and the book references it. It's a really good design. I've not seen it a ton in social work research because it is very complicated to implement. But this is the idea that if we want to say changes on the post-test due to the intervention or testing effects, we can randomly assign participants to 4 groups. We can say we're going to give 2 of those groups, 1 experiment, 1 control group, a pretest. Then we're going to give the experiment group an intervention and a post-test. And then we're also going to have 2 other groups. And one of those is an experimental group. No pretest, just the intervention and the post-test. And then the other control group is just the post-test. And what we would expect to find is if it's testing and retesting effects, we would expect that the group that got the pretest and the post-test and the intervention might have different results than the group that had just the intervention and the post-test. So it's a really nice way for us to compare multiple groups. But again, very challenging to do in social work research. We also have what's called the alternative treatment design with pretest. So this might be saying, look, I am in an organization and we already do trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy with all of our clients. But maybe I want to see if a different intervention is going to make a difference. And I've got this group of clients that aren't really using an intervention per se. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to randomly assign them into 1 of 3 groups. One of my groups is going to get the new intervention. Let's say it's an EMDR workbook. One of my groups is going to keep using the CBT intervention. Great. Let's see if the existing, or what we say TAU, treatment as usual, is working. And then maybe we have a group that aren't going to get the intervention yet. And we're going to do a pretest, intervention or not, and then a post-test. And so again, this is a really great way to say, are there differences? Do participants who get an intervention show a change? Is it less about the intervention and more just about getting treatment? Or is it more about one treatment being more effective than the other? Also, we have what are called dismantling studies. And the book gives a really good example about this, but the one that I saw that I loved is I did a lot of research about the effects of yoga on men who are incarcerated. And so one of the studies I found said yoga is both stretching, but it's also mindfulness and breathing. And they wanted to say, what is actually causing the improvement in the individuals doing this program? And so they had 4 groups where they randomly assigned participants. One group, they did yoga where they did stretching and breathing, then did a post-test. One group did just yoga stretching. The third group did just the breathing, the mindfulness part, and then one group did no intervention. And so when they looked at all of them, they were able to kind of tease out and say, hey, is it both of them combined? Is it the stretching and the breathing, the physical part of it and the mindfulness? Is it just mindfulness? Is it just stretching? So sometimes you can do these dismantling studies to see what is really the element that's effective. Now, the book talks about how they did this with EMDR and some of the limitations of this, but it can provide us some really good insight. A lot of our interventions are often complicated and have multiple components. So this can be a really interesting way to see which of the components are actually the most effective, or is it all of them together that makes them an effective intervention? So those are our experimental designs, and then obviously our pre-experimental designs. Now, the book talks a lot about randomization or random assignment as a way to address those threats to internal validity. It's important to note that random assignment or randomization is not the same as random sampling. We'll talk about sampling more later in the semester. This is more about how we assign people to groups. Now, one of the challenges is there's still limits in comparability. What if we randomly assign people, but one of our groups ends up really heavy on one age group and the other is really light? So we have a thing called matching. And matching is a really cool idea. It's the idea that when you're doing a study, you want to make sure for every individual you have someone similar as well. So I don't just have one 15-year-old, I have 2 15-year-olds. And I don't just have one 18-year-old, but I have 2 18-year-olds. So I say, okay, I have a 15-year-old Caucasian male, and I have another who's a Caucasian 15-and-a-half-year-old male. So very similar. And I have an 18-year-old Hispanic male, and I'm going to make sure I have another 18-year-old. Oh, he's 18-and-a-half-year-old Hispanic male as well. So I'm going to make sure that I have similar, at least a pair. And then what's going to happen is when I randomly assign them, I'm going to make sure there's an equal number of each type of person represented in the group. So for example, if I have matches and I say, okay, I'm going to randomly assign each one of these into the controller experiment group, well, you could see I would have similar, comparable looking groups. Now, if I randomly assign them a little bit differently, you could see the 2 groups still have one 15-year-old and one 18-year-old. The other experimental group is one 15-year-old and one 18-year-old. So I've seen this a lot in social work research where you're really trying to look at different demographics and variables. You can say, look, we're going to match people to make sure that our two groups are pretty comparable, and then we're going to administer the intervention to one and not to the other. So this can be really helpful and increases that internal validity. Finally, a few other study issues to think about are things like measurement bias, which is the idea that if we know which group is which, we might impact it positively or negatively. If we know that this is the experiment group and we really want to show that this intervention is effective, I might treat the individuals in that group a little bit differently to make them more successful. So one way to address this is the idea of blind or blind ratings, where you say, look, my raters or my observers or my researchers, they don't know who is who. They don't know which group is the control group and which is the experimental group. It also talks about research reactivity, the idea of obtrusive or unobtrusive observations and how we look at people and measure people can affect how they respond, or the use of placebos, where they don't really know what they're going to get and we see if there's a difference. Also, it talks about attrition, which is really common in social work research. Let's say you're trying to do a pretest and post-test for individuals who are unhoused. Well, you might be able to do a pretest, but in 3 months, are you able to find individuals who are unhoused? Maybe they've moved, maybe they're in a different city. And so we get this attrition, which can make it really hard to see change from a pretest to a post-test. Finally, the book wraps up talking a little bit about external validity, which is the idea of how generalizable is your research to other groups. And so we can only have external validity when we feel like it's representative of a larger population. And the challenge with social work research is we may often have small groups. And so we may not be able to confidently say, I can generalize this to other social work clients because it's such a small group and it may not be representative of the larger population. And so that's why in the next chapter, we're going to talk about quasi-experimental designs and how those are often a popular one that are used in social work research. Here are my references. Thanks.